No alarm clocks, no weekends, no backup plan. For a medieval peasant, each day began not with a goal, but with a warning: survive. Long before sunrise, they rose to cold air, aching limbs, and obligations. There was no luxury, no margin for failure. From Europe to Asia, Africa to the Americas, peasants lived not in history books, but in struggle, quiet, daily, and relentless. And yet, they endured. Not with wealth, but with knowledge, with hands, with systems built from mud, bone, and memory. This is their day. It begins in darkness, the kind that doesn't just fill the room but settles in your bones. Cold hangs in the air like breath suspended. No fire crackles, no voice calls out. Still, the peasant wakes. There are no clocks, no alarms, but the body knows. It's learned to listen. The creak of damp wood, the shifting weight of someone rising nearby, the distant cough of livestock unsettled in their pen. Across much of the medieval world, sleep didn't follow a single arc. It broke into two halves: first sleep, then a waking gap, and later, second sleep. In that in-between time, life continued quietly. This was the hour for tending things that couldn't wait. In some regions, people rose to stoke embers buried beneath ash, coaxing just enough heat to keep illness away. Others fed chickens or stirred fermenting jars tucked into dark corners. In parts of feudal Japan, farmers used this hour to step outside and gauge the sky. Not for beauty, but for weather. A particular weight in the wind might mean early frost. In the Balkans, a missing sound, a dog that should be barking, might signal a threat moving through the woods. It was also a time for thought. Not meditation in the modern sense, but something slower and deeper. Prayers murmured to icons in the dark. Conversations spoken so softly they became indistinct. Worries unfolded, then folded back again. With no candles to waste and no labor yet demanded, the mind wandered differently in these hours. Children turned in their straw beds, limbs tangled under rough wool. Elders sat quietly by the wall listening, not to anything in particular, but to the shape of the night itself. It wasn't fear that filled this space. It was awareness. This world had no switches to flip, no distractions to scroll through. Time passed because the body said it should. The first sleep ended because the house needed something, because the cows were restless, because instinct whispered that it was time to check on the fire. And when the hour was spent and the cold a little deeper, they returned to sleep. Not because the night had ended, but because there was still work to do when it did. Clothing wasn't about style. It was armor. And for the medieval peasant, getting dressed in the morning wasn't a moment of comfort. It was the first reminder that survival had a cost. The first layer was often linen, if they were lucky enough to have it. Thin, worn, rarely clean. Over that came wool, coarse, oily, and rough on the skin. It was never soft. It held the smell of sheep and smoke, and if not properly washed, it harbored lice and fleas that no one had the time to fully chase away. In Europe, wool was everything. It protected against wind and damp, but it itched and scratched constantly. There was no cotton for most, no silk unless stolen. Peasants lived wrapped in fabric that hurt them but helped them live. Far from Europe, the texture of suffering changed, but not the logic behind it. In Japan, many peasants wore bark fiber. Inner mulberry bark was soaked, boiled, beaten into threads, then woven tightly into garments called kaji. These clothes were stiff, unforgiving, sometimes layered with wax or ashes to make them more weather-resistant. They cracked in winter, they burned in summer, but they lasted. In parts of Africa, clothing was made from raffia or beaten tree bark, sometimes softened with oil but still rigid and difficult to sew. In colder zones, hides were added, stitched crudely with sinew, turned rough side inward for warmth. In the Andes, alpaca wool was king, but even that was coarse when unrefined. People slept in the same clothes they worked in. There was no changing, only layering. Color was rare. Dyes were expensive, laborious, and often reserved for ceremonial pieces. When used, they came from roots, insects, or rusted iron. A reddish hue in your tunic might have come from crushed madder root, boiled for hours over a smoky fire. A dull yellow could mean weeks of soaking in fermented urine and bark. Nothing came easy, not even color. Seams were reinforced by hand. Tiers were patched with whatever was available, sometimes with leather, sometimes with rope. In some regions, clothing was waxed to repel water. In others, it was simply accepted that the rain would find its way in. When a peasant dressed in the morning, it was never for appearance. Every thread was stitched with labor, and every layer reminded them that warmth came at a cost. Comfort wasn't the goal. Endurance was. A home wasn't something you bought. It was something you built, by hand with whatever the earth allowed, and always with the understanding that it would need constant repair. For the medieval peasant, shelter wasn't protection from nature. It was part of it. In the Andes, houses were made of adobe, sun-dried bricks shaped from clay, straw, and animal dung. These homes retained warmth in the cold mountain nights and stayed cool in the high-altitude sun. The materials were local, the labor collective, and the results humble but effective. Similar structures rose in West Africa, where millet stalks and mud created domes that resisted wind and heat with surprising efficiency. In Eastern Europe, homes were built from wattle and daub, woven wooden frames smeared with a mixture of clay, straw, and manure. It smelled, yes, but it worked. Floors were dirt, not metaphorically, literally. Packed earth sometimes swept smooth with branches or layered with straw to soften the impact of steps and absorb moisture. Over time, oils from cooking and skin turned these floors dark and smooth, almost polished. There were no tiles, no insulation beyond what nature provided. Roofs were low, angled sharply to shed snow or rain. Thatched with reed, palm, or straw, they required yearly maintenance. Leaks were expected, patched with mud or fresh bundles. In parts of the Ottoman Empire, Campaneses added animal hides to reinforce thatch during heavy winters, tying them down with vines or gut. Windows were rare. Light meant cold. Openings were covered with oiled cloth, wooden shutters, or nothing at all. The focus was always on conserving heat, not welcoming sunlight. Smoke from the fire vented through cracks, darkening the rafters and choking the lungs, but chimneys were a luxury no one could justify. Inside, walls were often used as storage. Hooks, baskets, and bundles hung from every available beam. A single shared bed of straw and cloth took up the warmest corner, nearest the hearth. Chickens might live inside during the cold months. So might goats. The separation between human and animal space was blurry, but warmth was warmth. These were not houses of pride or permanence. They were functional, fragile, and alive. They breathed moisture. They shifted with the seasons, and when they fell apart, they were rebuilt with the same patience and dirt that had always been there, waiting. But the house was only half the story. What truly defined a peasant's life lay just outside, on the land they worked and never owned. The land outside the door might feed you, but it didn't belong to you. For most medieval peasants, from the fields of France to the valleys of Anatolia, working the soil meant answering to someone else. A lord, a sultan, a noble family you'd never meet. The harvest was yours only after others had taken their share, sometimes in grain, sometimes in livestock, sometimes in days of your life. In Europe, the feudal system turned land into leverage. Campaneses were allowed to till strips of land, but only if they gave a portion of everything to their overlord. A tithe to the church, labor owed to the manor. Even access to the village mill or oven came with a cost. The rights weren't written, they were expected. And failing to meet them could mean losing the only soil you had. In the Ottoman Empire, the Timar system worked differently, but the effect was the same. Land was granted to military officials in exchange for service, and peasants lived and farmed under those Timar holders. There was structure, yes, but little security. You could plant and sow and harvest with your whole family, and still have nothing guaranteed for the next season. Elsewhere, the pattern echoed. In imperial China, peasant farmers paid rent in rice or silver. In Andean societies, before colonial disruption, land was shared through collective labor rotations, but individuals still owed tribute in food and textiles. Everywhere, man came with strings, and each string pulled at your time, your freedom, your body. This weight shaped daily decisions: what crops to grow, ones that yielded enough for taxes and still left something to eat, when to work, as long as the sun allowed. Even rest had to be earned. In busy seasons, peasants worked through injury, through fever, through childbirth. Not because they wanted to, but because the margin for refusal didn't exist. Still, they adapted. Mixed crops to prevent failure. Let animals graze near boundaries to fertilize both sides. Hid small sacks of grain for emergencies. Swapped favors with neighbors when one family fell behind. There was no legal safety net, only the quiet, risky trust of those who shared the same burden. And that burden didn't stop at the fence. Even what you managed to grow and as man's caught. Every bite came with risk. Food didn't arrive shrink-wrapped or stamped with expiration dates. It came from the earth, from storage pits, from hands that sometimes made mistakes. A misjudged root, a spoiled grain, a mushroom that looked too much like the safe kind. For the medieval peasant, eating wasn't just nourishment, it was a calculation. In Russia, rye bread was a staple, cheap, filling, and reliable, until it wasn't. Stored in damp granaries or thatched roof cellars, rye often became host to ergot, a parasitic fungus with deadly consequences. Those who ate infected bread suffered hallucinations, convulsions, burning limbs. Some called it a curse, others called it St. Anthony's fire. It swept through villages without warning, turning the most trusted food into poison. Elsewhere, the dangers were different but just as real. In arid regions, roots and tubers stored underground could develop toxins if not processed properly. Some had to be soaked for days, then boiled, then dried. Miss a step, and the result was paralysis, or worse. In Northern Europe, peasants foraged for mushrooms and berries, but generations of oral knowledge were required to tell the edible from the deadly. One bad season could break that chain of memory. One mistake could kill a family. Preservation added its own hazards. Salting meat too lightly meant rot. Leaving vegetables too long in brine encouraged botulism. Even beer, often safer than water, could turn sour and sickening if the fermentation failed. And yet, they kept trying because they had no choice. Peasants developed defenses. They smelled their food, tasted a little first, fed questionable bits to chickens or pigs before serving them to children. In some cases, they added vinegar or strong herbs like garlic or horseradish, not for flavor, but as crude antiseptics. These weren't foolproof methods, but they were what stood between a meal and a funeral. The idea of safe food was always provisional. A blessing one season could be a curse the next. That uncertainty lingered in every meal. It shaped not just what people ate, but how they thought about hunger, caution, and luck. Still, no one ate alone. And not all labor was visible in the fields. Not every hand held a tool in the field, but every hand worked. The survival of a medieval household didn't rest only on the man with a plow. It depended just as much, sometimes more, on those whose work left no furrows, but whose absence would bring everything down. Women and children weren't helpers. They were the hidden structure beneath it all. Before dawn, a woman might already have tended the hearth, pulled the day's grain from storage, checked the fermentation jars, and boiled cloth for reuse. She didn't do this in isolation. She did it while feeding a baby, silencing a cough, or monitoring the heat of buried stones used to warm sleeping bodies. In parts of Scandinavia, women repaired fishing nets and mended thatched roofs while nursing children on their laps. In West African villages, they cultivated backyard gardens packed with medicinal plants, used to treat wounds, fevers, or births that arrived early in the cold season. In the Balkans, girls as young as 6 led goats through frost-covered fields, listening for predators more than they talked. In medieval China, children were responsible for feeding poultry, fetching water, and sometimes carrying messages between households. Play was a luxury. Observation was survival. You learned quickly, or you cost the family dearly. Elderly women, often overlooked, held medical knowledge passed down by word of mouth. They knew how to bind a sprained ankle with boiled herbs, how to stop bleeding with cobwebs, or when to burn certain woods to ward off pests. These weren't superstitions. They were inherited systems born from necessity. Inside every house, there were jobs that could never stop. Lice had to be picked out of clothes and hair. Stored grain had to be checked daily for signs of mold. Wooden buckets swelled and leaked without warning. Animals delivered offspring that needed warmth and care within minutes, or they would die before dawn. These tasks didn't wait for the field work to end. They happened in parallel, in silence, under constant pressure. And they weren't thanked. They weren't even acknowledged. But when they failed, everything failed. Even so, when the work was done and the fires dimmed, there was still one more layer between order and collapse. Injury was inevitable, sickness a season. But for most medieval peasants, there were no doctors to call, no apothecaries within reach. Healing happened at home, or not at all. And when it worked, it wasn't because of science. It was because someone remembered what had once worked before. In rural India, neem leaves were crushed into pastes, rubbed on wounds, steeped into teas to reduce fever. Ghee was applied to burns. Turmeric was considered a sacred root and a frontline defense against infection. In the forests of Scandinavia, mosses were gathered and packed into cuts to stop bleeding. Steam from pine branches was inhaled during chest illnesses. Bathing in hot water, if possible, was a treatment not just for the body but for the soul. Midwives were more than birth attendants. They were surgeons, pharmacists, and priests rolled into one. They memorized the timing of contractions and the color of fatal fevers. They kept knives sharp with stone and fire. Some kept bundles of dried herbs wrapped in cloth, hung from beams, ready to be burned or boiled at the first sign of swelling. In Africa and the Middle East, Camponeses used honey to seal wounds. They knew which bark reduced inflammation, which roots dulled pain. In Europe, the line between healing and faith blurred completely. Blessings were muttered over poultices, and charms were tied to wrists with string. Some called it magic, others called it hope. There were dangers too. Some cures burned more than they healed. Certain molds placed on open wounds caused infection. Bloodletting, though common, weakened already fragile bodies. Misidentifying a plant could kill quicker than the illness it was meant to treat. But when the choice was between an untested cure and doing nothing, the decision rarely took long. Knowledge was passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, not through books but through story, practice, and memory. Each household had its own toolkit: a knife, a needle, a cloth, a handful of leaves and roots whose names no one ever wrote down. And yet, even with all this knowledge, even after every treatment was tried, there were things no herb could fix. Things that lived in the night, in the wind, in the silence after a candle goes out. When the chores were done, when the animals were fed and the fires banked, and the last bits of food scraped from the pot, silence crept in, not just across the room, but across the mind. Night was not rest, not entirely. It was exposure to cold, yes, but also to thoughts that had nowhere to go during daylight. Fear took its own shape after dark. In many parts of Europe, iron objects were placed near doorways or buried beneath thresholds, not to block people, but to repel spirits. A horseshoe above the frame, a knife beneath the bed. In West Africa, griots told stories of ancestors, spirits, and trickster gods, not just to entertain, but to teach children what to fear, what to respect, and what not to say aloud after sunset. In the Andean highlands, coca leaves were burned for protection. In Japan, ofuda charms were pasted near sleeping areas to ward off illness, misfortune, or something worse. These weren't theatrics. They were systems of psychological survival. Children clung to stories about clever animals and protective spirits. Elders whispered warnings about fields that swallowed people whole. Some believed a prayer could strengthen crops. Others believed failure to speak it could invite ruin. The world was thick with invisible rules, and following them gave shape to chaos. Superstition, to the outside eye, often looks like weakness, but for the peasant, it was structure. In a world where a cough could become death and a failed harvest could mean hunger for a year, belief was insulation. If you couldn't control the world, at least you could understand it in symbols. And so, before sleep, stories were spoken, not from books, but from memory, passed like tools, like seeds, like fire. Stories weren't entertainment, they were protection. They were warnings encoded as bedtime tales. As the fire dimmed and the house fell quiet, the family curled together beneath rough blankets. The dog shifted. Someone coughed. The wind rattled the roof. The child asked one more question about the woman in the woods. The mother answered in a whisper, her hand resting over the child's chest. The dark was still outside, but now it had a name. They didn't have comfort, or certainty, or control, but somehow they made it through the cold, the hunger, the silence, the work. The medieval peasant's world was small, but it was dense, with knowledge, with rhythm, with invisible systems passed from hand to hand. Their strength wasn't measured in tools or titles, but in memory, in endurance, in how much they could carry without breaking, and how often they rose before the sun when there was nothing left in the pantry but hope and a heel of bread. They didn't write books. They left no monuments. But they taught through repetition, through the way a fire is banked, or a root is boiled, or a story is whispered when the dark grows too heavy. We remember them in fragments: mud walls, worn sandals, hollow eyes in an old painting. But behind those fragments was something much more solid, a life lived close to the ground, not easy, but full. And maybe, if everything around us were to fall away, if the noise stopped and the light vanished, we'd find ourselves looking back, not forward, not to copy what they did, but to finally understand why they did it that way.